Awesome. Okay, so Rose, if we can, there we go. So we've now recording. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. So this webinar, we're going to be taking a look at how can you leverage beneficial ownership disclosure within responsible and resilient supply chains. This is part of the OECD conference, which is kicking off next week. So it's one of the fringe events. So this webinar is organised in conjunction with the OECD Forum on Responsible Mineral Supply Chains, which kicks off in Paris next week. So hopefully lots of you will be going along to that, and you will certainly meet two of our lovely speakers that we have here today. So go and find them when you get to the forum next week. There are also a number of other forums or webinars that are going on just like this. So please do feel free to go and click on the link that is in the chat. If you missed it earlier, we're just posting it again now. Go and explore some of the other events that are in there as well. My name is Dr. Sarah Gordon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a risk management and sustainability consultancy called Satarla, and also the co-founder of a not-for-profit called Responsible Raw Materials. I wear a number of other hats in my spare time, such as being a board member for Women in Mining UK, Geology for Global Development, and also the lead on one of the Horizon Europe research projects called Vector. But I'm the boring person in the room here today, which is a good thing, because I am joined by two fabulous people who are well and truly experts when it comes to what on earth is this thing called beneficial ownership. So the first expert who I'd like to welcome to the stage to introduce himself is the fabulous Tim Law. Tim, do you want to say hello to everybody? And then I'll introduce Ludovine.
Right, thank you, Sarah, and hello to everybody. Just by way of background, my background is in the private sector, in the mining sector. I'm a finance professional by training, and spent about 12 years working for Anglo American, the global mining company, looking after all issues to do with tax transparency and reporting and reputation in that sort of space globally for the Anglo American group. So across Africa, Latin America, Australia, and elsewhere. I'm an independent consultant now and have been for nearly 9 years. And one of the areas I work in is beneficial ownership transparency. And I'll talk a bit in a minute about what I mean by that. But by way of background, I've helped support countries who are implementing beneficial ownership regimes across 4 continents. So this is across Africa, Asia, Latin America. There's lots of countries that are looking at this topic. And the work I do is to help those countries design and implement their regimes for collecting beneficial ownership information. But I also work with businesses on how to leverage and use that information. So what is the business use case of beneficial ownership? So that's me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Tim. You have set the bar high. But to meet that bar is the wonderful Ludovine Wouters. Ludovine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for hosting this discussion. Hello, everyone. My name is Ludovine Wouters. I am a strategy, governance, and policy advisor focusing on mineral policy issues, primarily in emerging markets. A lot of my work over the last few years has also involved connecting the dots between stakeholders or policy shapers who need to look at mineral value chains, and particularly mining, because this has become now a strategic issue with geostrategic as well as operational implications globally. So a lot of the focus that I would like to bring to this discussion is how beneficial ownership features in a wide array of responsibility, transparency approaches, and how that is part of the critical minerals agenda, and hopefully how it plays out going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Ludovine. So as you can see from the introductions from the wonderful Tim and the lovely Ludovine, they play very much into the hands of the topic of conversation that we'll be exploring today, which, as a reminder, is all about leveraging beneficial ownership disclosure in responsible and resilient supply chains. And this fits very, very nicely into the theme of the conference that will be taking part over the next week or so, where the OECD Forum will feature sessions on combating everything from corruption through to other different aspects, and engaging with mining communities in high-risk areas and taking action with regards to potential environmental degradation linked to mineral processing and production. A key theme with regards to this area of discussion will be on leveraging due diligence to foster synergies between the policy objectives of responsible and reliable supply of minerals that, of course, we all need for that responsible and that just energy transition. So with regards to today, the focus is very much around beneficial ownership. And I know that Tim has got some slides to kick things off with, because, of course, a picture gives us 1,000 words, doesn't it, Tim? So Tim will start sharing his slides very, very shortly. But with regards to that, so beneficial ownership is really about identifying the real people who ultimately own or control those organizations that we're interested in. And rather than me giving this overview, I'm going to hand over to the true experts. Tim, do you want to kick us off with regards to what on earth is this thing called a beneficial owner?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. And I thought for that moment you were about to start working through my slides, which is fine. So I will start off by just giving a sort of high-level overview of what we mean by beneficial ownership. And apologies to those in the room who are well steeped in this topic, but I suspect that there are others to whom this is a slightly newer subject area. So what do we mean by beneficial owners? What we mean is, who are the natural persons, so we're talking about real flesh and blood people here, who ultimately own or control an entity, whether that's a company or a trust or any other sort of legal vehicle. So we're looking through any complex ownership structures to get to the people who sit at the very top. So the people who either directly or indirectly have ownership or have control by some other means, whatever that might be, or who ultimately benefit from a company. So when we're talking about a beneficial owner, we're not talking about another company. If there are holding companies in a structure, those you look straight through until you get to a real person. We're not talking about trusts. If you come to a trust, you look through that and look at who the beneficiaries and the trustees are of that trust and the settlers. And we're not looking at nominee shareholders. So there is sometimes a misconception that beneficial ownership is all about nominee arrangements, and it's about people holding shares on behalf of somebody else. That is a subset of beneficial ownership, but what we're talking about here is just looking in cases where there may be no nominee arrangement, but there may be multiple layers of ownership of companies, which make it difficult for you to understand who you're really doing business with. So a very simple example here on screen, where we have a reporting company, and that is the company which may well be the supplier, customer, client, or business partner. And what beneficial ownership will tell you is who is the person who sits above the holding companies, who is the real person who is owning and controlling this company. That's obviously a very simple example, and actually the vast majority of businesses out there are simple examples because they are small businesses owned by one or two people. Some slightly more complicated examples. So the one on the left is an example where a business may well be owned by two people, and they are each beneficial owners. So there isn't just one beneficial owner of a company, there can be multiple beneficial owners. And the example on the right is again a little more complex still, where there are a number of beneficial owners who have smaller shares and interests in the business. So there are lots of different ways in which people can be beneficial owners, and I'm not going to attempt during the course of today's session to try and cover that, because that's approximately a week-long training course. So what I will do for the moment is suffice to say that beneficial ownership is about looking at the real people who sit at the top of the chain. So who is doing work on beneficial ownership? What's driving beneficial ownership? Well, I'm sure given that this is a minerals related event, most people will be familiar with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. EITI, of which there are 50-something countries around the world currently implementing the latest version of the EITI standard, which is the 2019 version. The 2019 version includes a requirement for public disclosure of beneficial ownership information for all companies which are operating or bidding for licenses in those 57, I think it is, implementing countries. And that's been in the standard in some way or another now for nearly 10 years. There's another version of the EITI standard we expect to come out in June this year, and that's only going to, well, it may increase the beneficial ownership expectations, but it certainly won't reduce them. The next acronym is one that may be less familiar, which is the Financial Action Task Force, which is a global organization which works on anti-money laundering and combating terrorism financing. And almost every country in the world is signed up to Financial Action Task Force, and therefore trying to meet the 40 recommendations across a whole range of different subject areas. But one of those in particular, recommendation 24, requires that accurate beneficial ownership information is available to government agencies and law enforcement agencies in order to combat financial crime. There's an increasing emphasis from FATF that information is collected centrally and held by government in a central register, but it isn't an obligation under FATF. The European Union's also been a big driver of beneficial ownership transparency, and the anti-money laundering directives of the EU require that EU member states have public beneficial ownership registers, and there is now a move towards making those registers interoperable and effectively a single repository of beneficial ownership data across the 27 EU member states. There's a slight ripple in that, which I won't talk about today, where the European Court of Justice has found that there is a contradiction between public registers of beneficial ownership and certain other EU rights. But broadly speaking, the direction remains towards public beneficial ownership in EU member states. And as is relevant, given the organization which is hosting this conference over the next 2 weeks, the OECD Due Diligence Guidance, I'm not going to go through that whole title because it's far too long, does include reference to beneficial ownership in places and calls upon those who are implementing that guidance to understand the ownership, including the beneficial ownership of suppliers and relevant service providers. So there's a lot of aspects of this which are driving beneficial ownership reporting. Lots of those, as I've already mentioned, go back to government law enforcement and tackling financial crime. But there's another really important aspect to this, which is the use of beneficial ownership information by the private sector. And in cases where beneficial ownership information is in a public register, that then becomes a very straightforward process because you can access that information from a register. But even when it isn't, there's an increasing expectation for businesses to be building beneficial ownership transparency into their supply chain due diligence. So to understand who their suppliers are, and by that, we don't just mean what's the name of the company, or even what's the parent company, but who are the people who ultimately are behind controlling and benefiting from those companies that we're doing business with. So in terms of the direction of travel, we are now moving towards more and more economy-wide beneficial ownership regimes. So EITI, that's clearly sectoral because it reports beneficial ownership of extractives companies, but lots of countries that have gone through the EITI process have now implemented economy-wide beneficial ownership. So examples of that might be Ghana, Mongolia, Armenia, all of whom are EITI countries and are implementing have implemented economy-wide regimes. And there are lots of others that are working on that at the moment, including Trinidad and Tobago and others. And equally, the Financial Action Task Force is moving more towards understanding who might have access to beneficial ownership information. It doesn't quite go as far as public access at the moment, but it is certainly moving towards the hosting of beneficial ownership information in central registers. So the topic of beneficial ownership is a moving one. There is still lots of work being done in lots of countries to meet obligations that have been made to implement beneficial ownership registers. But the question really then is, who is using beneficial ownership information? So in the first instance, beneficial ownership information frequently gets used by banks, lawyers, and accountants as part of their customer due diligence. And in most countries, anti-money laundering legislation requires banks, lawyers, and accountants to understand who the beneficial owners are of their clients before they take them on, and then continue to understand that throughout the time that they are engaged in a client relationship. And where do those banks and lawyers get beneficial ownership information? Well, in general, it's about actually asking businesses to provide that information to you. So the question is, before you take on a client, and if we move this across into kind of supply chain, before you take on a supplier, then you need to understand who are the beneficial owners of the companies that are in that supply chain. Beneficial ownership registers are useful for testing whether the information you're being told is correct. In general, people aren't using them as the primary source of information. But how can you get that information and from where? So there are registers in lots of different countries. The UK has a freely accessible public register of beneficial ownership. So from anywhere in the world, any of you who are joining this webinar now, or any of you who are watching the recording, could go to the UK Companies House website and can look up the beneficial ownership of any company that is on the UK register. The same is true of many EU countries. Some have currently taken their registers offline to public access, but that may well be reversed fairly soon. There are also sectoral EITI beneficial ownership registers or information in those 50 EITI countries, and there are more coming. So interestingly, the lines of where beneficial ownership information is available as to where it isn't doesn't follow any kind of traditional lines. So it isn't developing and developed countries. It isn't that the developing world is doing this and the developed countries aren't, or vice versa. There are a number of jurisdictions across Africa and Asia who have beneficial ownership registers, but so does the UK and the EU. But there are other jurisdictions which currently don't. The US is just in the process of designing and implementing its regime. And there are other developed countries that are not as far advanced as, for example, Ghana in this regard. So that's what beneficial ownership means, and that's how beneficial ownership can be accessed. And I guess maybe that kind of leads on to the question as to how does that fit into the responsible raw materials and the concepts around this conference. So I'll stop at that point and leave it to others to add some more.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Tim. And thank you for showing us those diagrams, because I think that really helped bring this to life. So what I've taken away from this so far is that a beneficial owner is a person, a human being, a physical person that you can stand around and talk with. It's not a company, it's not a trust, etc. So beneficial owner is a person. There are a number of very well regarded initiatives already in place around the world, some of which, of course, are economy wide, some of which have lovely registers that you can go in and take a look at. And depending on which jurisdiction or country you're in, you may be lucky enough to tap into a database that is freely available, so you can go snooping and find out who your beneficial owners might be. Snooping is another word for looking. It just sounds better. So with that, Lovely, Ludovine, do you want to come into this conversation and share your perspectives?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tim. I think that one of the interesting things about beneficial ownership is that it's one of these concepts that has been sort of the remit of specialized players who, fill in and or demand certain types of information. And I think that era is coming to an end. The question of control, both in terms of ownership, but also how that ownership is exercised, is one that's really at the heart of the criticality discussion. So we're all aware that for the last decade, maybe a little bit more, 15 years, the emergence of the concept of criticality of minerals, and increasingly a vision of criticality, not as a static picture of today's need, but increasingly as a projection of needs in order to either meet industrial requirements or increasingly to meet the requirements of the digital and energy transitions. And in the current global context, increasingly the notion of criticality has been linked also to defense and space, for example. So as the notion of criticality becomes more embedded and is increasingly being now brought into large regulatory and policy initiatives, the next step is to say, okay, so if it's critical, who has it? How do they use it? How do they share it? So I think beneficial ownership is one of these elements that we can safely rely on to increase the level of transparency, to increase the level of understanding in mineral supply chains in particular. I think this is the concern of policy shapers who are trying to think for a region, in the case of the EU, for a country, in the case of, say, the US or Canada or the UK. It's also the domain of policy shapers in producing countries who are thinking, okay, a lot of demand is coming in. How do we manage that relationship in a way that's ideally much more beneficial to our populations, our environment, and our future? So understanding who does what and what is driving their interest is core. I'm going to start by throwing a spanner in the works, is that beneficial ownership, as we were saying, very much hinges on the concept of a person. In the mineral world, increasingly, one of the questions or issues is state control, whether that's, for example, state-owned entities or state-controlled entities having access to minerals, or through a variety of subsidiaries, and sometimes through commercial agreements, having the capacity to determine how minerals are produced, processed, shipped, exported, imported. So the importance of state ownership, state exercise of ownership, state control is also becoming part of the conversation. And many of the reflexes that we already have as technicians on beneficial ownership should serve us to look across value chains at where the pinch points are and who is in control of those pinch points. The other thing I would say is that this notion is now being really studied in research, but also in support of policy. And this is particularly the case because in some of the leading jurisdictions where mining and minerals investment is structured, okay, Canada, Australia, increasingly the US, you will have a lot of shareholders who are fundamentally very passive. So you'll have institutional shareholders holding small or big companies, because that's the other specificity of critical minerals, is that critical minerals will come in all shapes and sizes. We're going to talk about very small companies, very tightly controlled with small deposits, all the way up to the big boys. And what you get in the shareholding of these can be very passive institutional investors who will not actually exercise much control beyond the simple role of a shareholder, first of all, entrusting the board, but also taking, I would say, wide angle views on the sustainability, the profitability of the operation. And then you will have all the way on the other side of the spectrum, extremely controlling shareholders. And this is where understanding who and why is absolutely key. Because as you look at minerals today, no company is an island. That was very poetic of me, I think. But increasingly, what's important when you're looking at the notion of control is what are the commercial links and who actually holds the capacity to determine what another company will do. And that's what's interesting, is that the fluid nature of control is increasingly taken into consideration in policy. Yes, beneficial ownership is key. And then the additional aspects of that. Okay, so if that's the beneficial owner of company A, but also the beneficial owner of company B, and there happens to be, an export relationship between the two, what does that mean in terms of taxation in country? What are we looking at in terms of basis erosion and profit shifting? All of those links are becoming key, not just to the policy shapers who have been focusing on this, but increasingly to other companies, because this is an operational imperative now. You can't order minerals on Amazon. I know it sounds silly, but you now have a whole industrial sector realizing that, yeah, minerals, it's not a tap you turn on. So I think the level of transparency is going to increase as a result of those market forces. But simultaneously, and I don't want to sound pessimistic, when something becomes more valuable, when it's valuable not just in terms of monetary value, but also in terms of strategic and geostrategic value, it's also expected that the level of fraud, the level of violations of commercial trust, as well as shareholder trust, should also increase in the coming years, because the interests that are at play will conflict as much as, as often, if not more often, than they coalesce. So I'm happy to go further into the details of, okay, how does this play out in the EU, in the US? But I think those big picture things are very important to keep in mind, because we cannot be naive about the value of this information. And as Tim was saying, how to use it, but also who else is using it.
So with that, and thank you very much for that, Ludovine, fantastic. And by the way, if anybody has any questions or additional thoughts that they'd like to add to this discussion, please do feel free to put them into the chat. So just click on the button at the bottom of your screens and the chat box will magically appear. So please feel free to add them in there, or just wave at the screen or raise your hand, whatever you feel most comfortable with, and we'll bring you into this discussion. So with that, Ludovine, and I'm sure that Tim has thoughts on this as well. So we call this beneficial ownership, but as you so eloquently put it, no company is an island. And it's maybe not just about who might benefit from something, but who can influence or controls those different aspects within that network or that mesh of how all of these different organizations fit together. So maybe a question for Ludovine and then to Tim. What does beneficial ownership include, that who controls or who influences part? Is it the same or is that different?
So I think actually Tim would be best placed to respond first on the technical aspects. What I would say is that there is no critical minerals policy initiative now that does not include a reference to the notion of control. Interestingly, the EU, which just published the CRM Act a few weeks ago, sort of went home to mommy on this and refers in one of its key pillars of the CRM Act, which is the definition of what they call strategic projects. These are the projects where really you see that the union will focus its efforts. And in the definition and the criteria for the recognition of a project as strategic features a reference to the merger control directive and to the definition of control in the merger control directive. What that means is that the EU is very much aligning with the notion that control can be beneficial ownership, can be real ownership, but it can also be the situation of people who, without holding ownership rights, will exercise influence. So yes, beneficial ownership is key because it's the first port of call. It's the first way you check. But there's also a recognition that sometimes the very people who call the shots are not in any register. And I think that's important because it shows that we're trying to be very pragmatic about these approaches.
Thanks, Ludovine. Tim, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, I'd agree with that. I think if you look at the way in which beneficial ownership, and it maybe is a slight misnomer, the way that beneficial ownership is defined, for example, in the EU anti-money laundering directive, which is what determines the EU registers, but also in the Financial Action Task Force definition, the EITI definition, and most jurisdictions. It's defined as being the natural person who directly or indirectly has ownership or control. And that control is often not just looking at specific mechanisms for control. There's often a catch-all clause in there to say control by any other means. So that could, for example, be somebody who has one golden share in a company. And because of that one share that may give them very small level of ownership, they have the ability to appoint or remove board directors. They have the ability to make major strategic decisions for the business. I think just touching on another point, Ludovine, that you picked up on state-owned enterprises. You're right, and it's an interesting challenge when it comes to beneficial ownership of state-owned enterprises, because you could argue, if you look at ownership, well, are they owned by the entire population? Are they the beneficial owners? Well, clearly that's not the right answer. And that is exactly where the control piece comes in, because what you're then looking at is, where is that state-owned enterprise controlled? Is it controlled through a particular government ministry or government agency? Is there a particular individual within that ministry who has control over the activities of that state-owned enterprise? Because that in itself may then provide some insights as to whether there could be potential conflicts of interest or the higher risk of corruption. There's another concept within beneficial ownership called the politically exposed person. So a politically exposed person is anybody who holds a position of it can be political influence, or it could be in the military, or it could be a senior role within an international organization, or it could be a senior person within the judiciary, for example. And often what will be disclosed is people who are beneficial owners, but are also politically exposed persons, because that's one of the ways in which you can identify areas where there may be greater risk of corruption, greater risk of illicit enrichment, or other kind of forms of financial crimes. I think finally, and then I see we've got a question from the floor, but just to sort of talk a little bit about the use case that you touched on. One of the things which I see in jurisdictions when they're looking at designing and implementing these regimes and looking at the use case is local content. So an example of where this information can be really useful and information for a business in terms of looking at their supply chain is where you have either made a commitment to, or there is a legal obligation to a certain amount of local content within your supply chain. How do you know what's really local content? How do you know who really is behind the company that you are using in your supply chain, that it claims to be a local business, but then when you look at beneficial ownership, you find that it's actually owned somewhere else in the world and isn't really a local business, it's a front for someone else. There's a specific case there in South Africa around the broad-based Black economic empowerment requirements, which again is about who the real owners are of businesses. The other places that can be relevant is where there are people who are identified then by you as beneficial owners, that you can see that they are associated with particular conflict or are on sanctions lists, where it may not be evident if you're just looking at the contractual parties that there is somebody behind this business who really you may decide you don't really want to be doing business with. And I will just put one other slide up to give an example here. So I mentioned the UK has a beneficial ownership register. This is an example in the public domain taken directly from the UK beneficial ownership register. And what you can see in this company, on the left-hand side, this is a company, a property investment company. And in the absence of beneficial ownership information, what you would be able to see is, well, what's the correspondence address for this company and what does it do? And all this tells you is that the correspondence address for it is a trust company in the British Virgin Islands, and that it is an overseas company. And that's about all that you would be finding out pre-beneficial ownership transparency. Now, if we look across on the right-hand side, you will see that what the UK register will tell you, it will identify, in this case, a number of people who are beneficial owners. And I've just sort of zoomed in on the first of those, who is an individual in Bangkok. So you've immediately got more information about who the people are who ultimately own and control this business, which you wouldn't have had if you just looked at the statutory information about that company, which would just tell you that this is a company that sits in the British Virgin Islands. And you may well, I haven't looked on this, if you were to look at who the directors were, there may be some nominee directors, there may be some people sitting in BVI who say that they are the directors of the company. What this does is it goes beyond that and says who owns or controls the company. So this is exactly where you can get value in terms of your supply chain risk management. So yeah, that was what I wanted to add on that.
Tim, just before I bring Nikki into the conversation, and thank you, Nikki, for putting your hand up. Fantastic. Tim, just with regards to Companies House in the UK and that register that you were showing us just now, when did that level of detail come into force in terms of that level of transparency?
So the UK was the first country in the world to introduce a freely accessible public register of beneficial ownership. It was launched in 2016. It's taken a few years for the quality and quantity of data to ramp up. And one of the challenges that we face in the UK is that Companies House, which hosts this information, has historically just been an organization that registers and stores the registration of companies. So if you want a Companies House, will give you a company. There are changes going through at the moment to give Companies House more powers to identify red flags when it sees them and to investigate where there are red flags. But that sort of information has been around from 2016. EITI countries have had to implement a beneficial ownership register for the extractive sector since 2020, as has the EU. But there are lots more coming online all the time.
Great. So lots of lessons that can be learnt and shared in terms of the optimal ways of doing things, which is...
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the key things that jurisdictions are doing, is learning from each other so that this is improving all the time. If there's time, I can talk a bit later about the fact that there are some repositories that are pulling together publicly available beneficial ownership information into single places. But that's kind of maybe for a bit beyond this session.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. Nikki, do you want to come into the conversation and pose your question?
I just wanted to share that there are, it's a whole world, the KYC AML, and there's so many third-party providers where you can find all this information with politically exposed people and persons. I don't know if it's people or persons. And so PEPs, and you have all this negative news and everything that you'll need in one place. So, and there are cheaper options and more expensive options that you could use. Some start as just a couple of maybe under $100 per month. So that's those are, and they're really good. I use them for credit checks, and they're wonderful. One thing to take note, at least in the United States, record everything you're doing. If you're doing beneficial ownership or KML or KYC, AML, not KML, AML, KYC, always record what you're doing, because if anything happens, then the authorities are going to want to see that you've done your due diligence. I mean, of course, if it's a super sophisticated criminal, all the sites in the world might not be enough. So one tip is just record whatever you're doing, in case anything, ever happens.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Nikki. I don't know, Tim, if you've got any comments with regards to that, or Ludovine?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There is the most developed beneficial ownership processes sit within the banking, accounting, and legal professions, because whereas the conversation we're having really here is about risk mitigation, there is a statutory obligation for those organizations to understand beneficial ownership before they take a client on. So there's been a lot more ground trodden, I suppose, by those sectors. What is the newer space is that this being used by companies in the broader economy. So companies that are looking at their supply chains and looking at doing due diligence on those. There it is more generally a case of internal policy or guidelines such as those from the OECD, rather than statutory obligations. So for that reason, it's somewhere where there is more learning to be done. There's more understanding, and one of the real challenges is the starting point today, the fact that it is a new topic, and so part of this is about helping people to understand what is beneficial ownership, and actually why is it really useful for me in terms of mitigating risk. So I think I agree with you entirely. There are lots of resources out there. The UK register, which we've talked about, gets hundreds and hundreds of thousands of unique hits every month. The statistics are just astonishing, and the majority of those hits are from small and medium-sized enterprises doing due diligence on their suppliers, customers, potential business partners, competitors. So there really are people out there using this information, which is great.
On you go, Ludovine.
Yeah, could I perhaps just come in on this issue, because it's definitely been my experience that both the structuring of an information request, but also the use of the response information needs to be extremely contextualized. The value of certain positions, the way certain things can be expressed in one context have nothing to do with another. So I think it's also very important to recognize that, particularly we're all focused on minerals here today, there will be multiple border crossings, there will be multiple cultural and legal contexts where things, will be running in a certain way, but read or understood in another way somewhere else. And that, I think, is a specific exercise in proactive engagement, going beyond the information that's presented. And that is something that is both costly, it's complicated to do, and it's also where the opportunity lies. What I'm trying to say is, you will sometimes get information which, if read in, I don't know, jurisdiction A, would be an immediate red flag. Yet where that information plays out, it's actually quite irrelevant. On the other hand, there will be things which seem to you perfectly innocuous. But if you're not walking a little bit, in the boots of the people who are dealing with that entity, who are dealing with its day-to-day life operations and decisions, you won't really sense the value of those operations. So I think having public information, having standardized information is a great step forward, because it helps us to set certain bars of expectation of the quality and reliability of information. But information, like everything else, can be everything to everybody. So I think the vast majority of effort that's being undertaken, by industries that now have to confront both societal expectations of transparency, but also the operational imperative of understanding who is part of their universe, is about engaging with that information, managing it, understanding it, testing it. And, the unintended consequences of regulation is a constant topic of worry. If the bar that we set means that an industry basically says, I'm walking away from this jurisdiction, this sector, this aspect of my business, then we have achieved exactly the opposite of what we're looking for, because that means we're creating a great big vacuum for somebody who will not mind having to deal with uncertainty, as they name it, to take over that jurisdiction, that sector, those operations. So I just want to really stress that the use of that information, but also the effort of becoming engaged with the people and the places and the operations behind that information, is key. And it will become more key as things evolve.
So, Ludovine, you mentioned that word efforts there. Now, with regards to this, and of course, a lot of the work that's going into the transparency of supply chains, raw material value chains, etc. at the moment, one of those quintessential questions is how granular or how detailed does the data need to get? Now, from what we've discussed here, is in a perfect world, you know absolutely everything about every single organization. But in reality, the practicality of that is really difficult. So where do you draw that line in terms of the level of detail that's required that is good enough?
I'm almost going to throw that one back to you, because my first port of call when you have to make that decision is to think very clearly about what are the potential risks attached to having or not having information, what's my appetite, and where do I think I can run with this, or on the contrary, I want to be able to seize more of this opportunity. So I don't think there's a standard line. I think each company, each investor has to be, again, putting this information as part of a much wider view of their threats and opportunities. So of course, this is where we go to you.
So this is my risk management hat. So in terms of balancing that potential threat, that potential opportunity and the uncertainty that's rolled into it. But I'm going to be really cheeky and bring in Tim on this, because I'm keeping half an eye on the time as well. Tim, I suspect you've got a thought with regards to where does that line come in terms of how much detail is required?
Well, actually, I would entirely agree with Ludovine's comment, not in terms of just batting it straight back to you, but in terms of I think it is about risk assessment. So whether it is national governments who are collecting this information for the purposes of law enforcement, then the starting point is a national risk assessment, and what types of entities and what types of transactions pose the greatest risk of money laundering and terrorism financing. But equally, if it's a private sector, if it's about supply chains, it is about, where does the risk look greatest, and where does the beneficial ownership information, because beneficial ownership is not the universal panacea to risk. It is not going to solve all supply chain risk. It is not going to solve all risk of being involved with sanctioned individuals or criminals. It is part of the toolkit that you have as business to try and mitigate and manage risk. And so I think it's about how do you assess the role that it can play within your risk management toolkit, for want of a better word. And that depends on lots of variables: which sector you're operating in, which jurisdictions you're operating in, what sort of risks that leads to. And this risk, Sarah, I know is absolutely tromping all across your front garden, in terms of how businesses, make those assessments and what they do in order to avoid those things coming to pass or mitigate the impact of them if they do. So I think, it is about looking at it in the round. It's about putting it into your mix of risk tools in order to help to end up with your an alignment, I guess, between your balance of appetite and ability to end up in the landing point you want to be. So there isn't a single answer for every business, because it just depends, which is a really answer, I know.
Could I give one example where this is really playing out right now, which is the US IRA? So we've all heard about the Inflation Reduction Act, and of course the fact that it's opened up a whole series of incentives to get minerals as well as components that are produced in the US or in countries with which the US has a free trade agreement. The IRA was adopted in August 2022, and just recently the US came out with implementation guidance explaining what they viewed as free trade agreement, which stunningly is not defined in the Act. But what's perhaps less discussed, but equally important, is that these incentives have an exclusion, which is that from, I think, 2024, any minerals or components that are produced by what is termed a foreign entity of concern can no longer benefit from any of the incentive framework. And the difficulty there is that the three words, foreign entity of concern, are in the Act. At the moment, the US has not yet published guidance on this, despite announcing it, back in December, because what is foreign? When you say an entity, okay, so the entity, its owners, its managers, its commercial partners, what's the universe? And where do you define what's your concern? What's your threat? What are you trying to mitigate? What are you trying to manage? So that is an exact example where you think you have it all by saying entities of concern, foreign entities of concern. But then you have to get to the nitty-gritty of how those words interact. And that's exactly an example of the risk assessment and risk approach to using these concepts, which is why it's hard.
Exactly. And I think with regards to all of this, as is the case with all forms of risk management, is it's always iterative. So it's context dependent, and that context keeps changing. It's data dependent, understanding dependent, and of course that keeps changing as well. But as well, we need to be able to have the freedom to actually change our minds with regards to where do we think something's important or not. Now, with that, you'll be amazed to note that time has flown by. In terms of, and I know that Tim has been answering some of your questions in the chat, so do keep them coming for the last few minutes. But with regards to that, so beneficial ownership is all about finding the people who have got something to do with either benefiting from that particular entity, but also hold the controlling or the influencing aspects with regards to what we're looking at here. There are a wide range of initiatives and registers, etc., that are out there that are constantly improving and expanding and developing with regards to the information that is contained within them. But as well, with regards to this, it all comes down to the context and being really pragmatic about what is the information that we need in order to be able to make a decision in terms of that part of a value or a supply chain, or the decision that we're about to make, say it's a merger or an acquisition or something similar with regards to that as well. So just in the last couple of minutes, Tim, I'm going to come to you first to ask you, what is your take-home resonating point that you'd like everyone to walk away from this webinar with? And then I'll come to Ludovine.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks for hosting this session today. I think the one thing I would say is that for you to go away and think, if you are looking at what the factors are that create risk within your supply chain, your mineral supply chain, and what you are doing to address and mitigate those risks, think about beneficial ownership. Think about the fact that it is a fundamental part of you understanding who is actually in that supply chain, not just corporate entities, but who are the people that sit behind the steps that are in that supply chain. And that by understanding who the beneficial owners are, then you will have a much better ability to understand where the risks really sit and manage and mitigate those risks. Beneficial ownership itself won't necessarily do that for you, but it may well help you to understand where there are red flags.
Thank you, Tim. Ludovine.
And I would definitely echo that. I think also at the moment we discuss these issues very much from the perspective of threats, perceived or real. I think transparency in supply chains is, yes, about dealing with those threats, anticipating them, mitigating their effect if they're realized. But there's also a lot of opportunity there. Increasingly, part of responsibility will be about demonstrating not just that we are, managing our impact where we are, but that the impact we have through others is part of how we make decisions. Understanding, again, who's in the supply chain, who they really are, as far as we can, define them, is increasingly going to be part of that picture of what a supply chain is and what its impact is.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ludovine and Tim. So my personal takeaway from this is that it's individuals, it's people who create that responsibility. And that's what beneficial ownership is really tapping into. So something that is very, very personal. And so therefore, hopefully, creates lots of nice, positive responsibility and reactions that come out of that. So everybody, if I can please invite you to put your hands together for a virtual round of applause for the fantastic Tim and Ludovine. Absolutely fantastic. For those of you who are going to be in Paris next week at the OECD Forum, some of us look forward to seeing you there. Fantastic. Also, as well, there are a whole myriad of conferences that are taking place over the next few weeks. If you enjoyed this discussion, then you can see Ludovine and Tim in action, I'm sure, again at the Responsible Raw Materials Conference, which takes place during the second week in May. And Rose will post the link to that conference into the chat now. So with that, thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.